Good morning, everyone. So today we're going to start off with going over some things, learning about the reef, learning about what you need to do the reef. So we're going to start off with water, right? The most basic element. Right? But if you don't have your water right, you don't have anything right, right? Right. Water is everything. It's literally 70% of our body is ourselves. So what you put in is what you're going to get out. Now, there's nothing saying that you can't have a beautiful reef from using just tap water that you condition with a conditioner. There's nothing saying that. There's hundreds of people who do it. However, I choose to make my own water. That kind of sounds weird, but I take tap water, city water, okay, and I run it through this bulk reef supply 4-stage value plus reverse osmosis deionization system. It's quoted to make 75 gallons of water a day from tap water, and it makes supposedly 75 gallons of deionized water every day. I think it actually makes more than that. I haven't actually measured it, but I'm almost positive it gets more than that. Okay. So how this works is the water comes out of the tap, right? Comes through this input line, goes into a sediment filter, which for city water isn't all that important because you wouldn't really expect a lot of sediment to be in the water. But it's still there anyway. It looks pretty clear. I change it when it looks dirty or we lose pressure on the system. Okay. The next phase is a 1 micron universal carbon block. That's going to remove chlorine, somewhat chloramines, not as well, depending on what kind of carbon block you get rated for. Certain carbon blocks are rated for chloramines. Some carbon blocks are rated for chlorine. Chloramine is just a different version of chlorine that some municipalities use to sanitize the water for human consumption. You can actually find out, there's a test strip, or you can find out from your water company by requesting a water report from them as to what they use, whether it's chlorine or chloramine. I actually just called up the Easton Water Authority and asked whether they use chlorine or chloramines and to what amount. Did I end up on a watch list for that? Yeah, probably. But if you've got to be on a watch list, there's worse ways to end up on one. So that removes the chlorine or chloramines, whichever one you have. Next, the water will go up into these 2 stages, okay? These are reverse osmosis membranes, right? So basically the pressure of the water forces water molecules through the membrane, but does not allow anything else to go through. This first membrane, right? So the wastewater that has all the stuff that we don't want, because all we want is water. We just want pure water, right? So all of that wastewater goes into this second membrane where the process is repeated. Okay? That wastewater then goes out and is discharged, because we're not going to use that. You can actually use it as drinking water. You can use it to water your lawn. Some people use it to run their washer when they make a bucket of water. There's nothing wrong with drinking it, especially if, and we'll go over some of the values and stuff, but especially if you don't have horrible water, it's still fine to drink. Then all of that water, the good water, the water that is just water, or at least mostly just water, because it doesn't remove everything. Sometimes its effective rate is about 90 to 99% rejection rate, okay? So some stuff will get through that. And that is what leads us to this last canister, okay? This last canister is what holds the deionization resin. There's 3 different kinds of resin that are in there, all 3 of which change color when they are depleted. So that resin binds to any other charged negative or charged positive particles that are left in the water after the RO membranes, and those particles stick to those like glue. Right? And then all that's left that comes out of it and goes to our buckets, or whatever you may choose to put it in, is just pure water. Now, not all water is created equally. Let me just get you off the mount here. Okay. So over here I have 2 samples. And a handy little TDS meter. Super cheap. It's super effective. I check it against a known value of dissolved solids, once a quarter. And we're going to check. This sample on the right here is tap water, right out of the tap. You can see we've got about 85 parts per million. Okay? Which is pretty respectable. It's kind of on the higher side, but it's still pretty respectable. We're going to shake it off, let it get back to 0. Okay? And then we're going to go over to our RODI water. And we'll see what we're at here. Rinse it off. Okay. And we're at 3 here. So with time, that will get down to 0, because I literally just had to clean out the and change the DI resin today. So a little bit of like TDS creep happened, so we're a little higher than I would like to be in the RO container, but it'll all equal out in the end. So we've got 87 parts per million coming in right over here, right? Goes through everything. We have this inline TDS meter, okay? So it's coming out of the RO membranes at 1 part per million of TDS, okay? And it's coming out of the DI resin at 0, and then goes all the way around, splits off, and goes into our water holding tanks. The one on the right is just for fresh water. The one on the left is just for salt water. So here we are filling up with fresh water because I was running a little low. And over here we have our saltwater mixing station, which has to be cleaned, because I just did a big water change not all that long ago. So that's all about water. So water. They have a lot of it, right? About 180 gallons. So yes, the tank is a 180 gallon display tank, but there's not 180 gallons of water in there, right? Because we have displacement from the rocks, displacement from the inch of sand at the bottom, and the tank isn't full to the very top either. So if you measure where the water line sits and enter the dimensions, it actually holds about 160 gallons of water to the line that it's at. And then you factor in, how much water is held in the pipes, the water that's in the sump, which if you do the math for there, it holds around 24 to 25 gallons. So we're sitting somewhere around 180 gallons of water, give or take maybe 10 gallons, maybe. Now, if water was as easy as just running it through the RODI unit and throwing some salt in, right? We'd all be running to the store and getting some of those Morton salt containers and just going to town. But it's not. It's not that simple. I use, a lot of people are going to argue, but I use instant ocean reef crystals. That's all I've ever used. I never really had any problems with it. Yeah, it mixes up pretty disgusting in the bucket, but then I have to clean it. All right, fine. But it's the most economical price-wise. So I make do with that. But there's so much more to the water. So we have elements, we have trace elements, iodine, potassium, all these other ones, with the three major ones, which are alkalinity, calcium, and magnesium. We want our alkalinity anywhere from 7 to 11. I shoot for a nice happy medium of 9.0. They also did just get their last dose to bring their alkalinity back up to where it needs or should be. Calcium anywhere from 400 to 450, maybe 460. The higher the numbers you get with your alkalinity and calcium, the higher the chances that it actually congeals together and precipitates out. And then the last is magnesium. Now for the fish, these three numbers are kind of unequivocal. They don't really care. Okay? All they care about is the salinity of the water, which I keep mine at 1.025. Salinity, just shy of 35 parts per thousand. And we check that with a refractometer. There's a bunch of different ways you can do it. If you go to Petco or some smaller local fish store, they're going to give you one of these little float hydrometers. They're useless. There's no way to calibrate them. There's no way to prove that they're even accurate. So why would you even risk what can be a very large investment in livestock to something that's made out of plastic that you can't confirm is right? My refractometer uses the refraction of light to tell me, looking through it. It gives a blue little line, and that tells me where my salinity is at. I like those. There's another one, there's some other ones. Neptune Apex actually has a probe that will tell you the salinity based on conductivity of the water, which is very good as well. There are drawbacks to that method as well. And then there's also a Milwaukee scanner, which kind of does the same idea of the refractometer. I like light because light cannot be altered. Light cannot have any flaw. So I calibrated my refractometer because you should always calibrate things. Otherwise they can stray, right? So we keep our salinity in check. We keep our alkalinity, our calcium. Mine sits right around 430. Last I checked it, it was 420 yesterday. And then magnesium around 1300, 1400. I've heard some people keep it a little bit higher, and sometimes that will help the coral as well. But those three, your alkalinity, your calcium, and your magnesium, are what your corals need. Not so much your soft ones, which are hard. The ones that make a bony skeleton. They use that alkalinity, that calcium, and that magnesium to precipitate out their bone, the coral structure. If you look on a coral reef and you see like rock, but it's white, that's actually coral skeleton, right? And they use that to, they draw it out of the water and they precipitate it out. So it's unequivocally more important to them what those three levels are at. And they absorb it, right? So they use it, which means it gets lower. And they all depend on precipitating that out based on your pH. I try to keep mine around 8.2 The magic number is 8.3. I find if you try to treat for a number, you're going to end up overshooting it in one way direction or another, and you're going to have more problems. So I just shoot for around 1.2. I have a CO2 scrubber on the skimmer just to help with that. Okay. But in theory, the higher you keep the pH, the easier it will be for the coral to precipitate that alkalinity and calcium out and make their skeletal structure. Along with that is their pollutants, right? So fish poop, they pee, food breaks down, everything breaks down eventually. And that goes through the nitrogen cycle. Starts off as ammonia, gets converted by bacteria into nitrite, which then further gets converted by more bacteria into nitrate. I would like my nitrate to be around 5 or 10 parts per million. Right now we're sitting at a resounding 0.75, which, if you remember from the other videos, is not a true number because we've got this horrible algae growth all over everything. So that's a false low. It's probably a bit higher than that. And also phosphate. Phosphate right now is, again, reading at 0, which is also not probably a real number, but it's still at 0. Now you don't want to be super low with those numbers because that can cause more problems, like dinoflagellates. Cyanoblooms can come at low or high ranges. And the coral actually needs an amount of phosphate to help them with their skeleton production and just their basic life. So you don't want it at 0, or at least a true 0. We're not at true 0, so it's not as worrisome to me or concerning. I'm more concerned with getting the algae out, right? And then we'll see what our real numbers are. And hopefully that will be solved in the coming week, maybe. So water is the most important thing in the world. To them, anyway. We want to keep the water as clear, clean, and pristine for them because that helps everything, right? The coral like it clean and clear so that they get the light. Right? Coral, one, they can consume food that they may catch, microorganisms and whatnot, but they also have this photosynthetic zoothanialy that gives them their pigments, right? That is actually photosynthesizing the light, and then they consume that food that is produced off of that. Okay. Temperature-wise, we want to keep in a decent range, like 77, and then really no higher than 80. I have mine set between, it cycles with the apex between 77.5 and 78.5. And then I have alarms and such in place so that if it were to go outside of those agreed upon parameters, that the apex will do things. It'll alert me that something is going on. For instance, if the temperature were to go too high, it would turn on a fan. It would make sure that the heater is turned off. It would eventually, as it gets higher and higher, it would turn off the lights. Not really that the LED lights produce as much heat into the tank as, let's say, metal halides would, or even like the fluorescent the XHOs. But in the stream of things, the apex would turn them off if it were to get too hot. just like a normal reef, there's water flow. You can kind of see it, hopefully, with some of the particles that are floating around. But you can definitely see it in the octospawn that's up there. That the water is moving in here. Okay? It's pumped back in through the tubes at the top, and it gives them a flow in the tank, just like a normal reef. Okay? And then there's pumps on either side that give a little extra oomph to the water flow. This we try to get, right? So that there's nice flow, algae doesn't build up, the coral can get all of the fresh nutrients that they need as they absorb what is immediately around them. And it allows anything that's floating in the water column to get sucked down and put through the filtration. So how do we replace alkalinity, calcium, and magnesium? Or any of the nutrients, right? So we look for ways to export nitrate and phosphate, whereas we look for ways to import calcium, magnesium, alkalinity, and those trace nutrients. Right? The trace ones, actually everything can be dosed. I dose alkalinity, calcium, and magnesium as needed. And then you can buy dosing that replaces those amino acids and the other trace elements like potassium and like iodine, things like that. I predominantly just do that with water changes right now. At some point, I probably will switch over and maybe dose some of them in to get them more in line, in tune, but that's not something I need to do right now. It can be handled perfectly fine with just the water changes as occasional as I do them. And then export-wise, I have a refugium that's growing some macroalgae, and the skimmer, which is hopefully pulling out the proteins in the water before they get the chance to actually break down to ammonia and then convert it to nitrate and then such. So that's the plan with that. That's really all there is about water, H2O. I hope you enjoyed this little educational segment, and I'll see you tomorrow.